Welcome, dear listener, to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where history becomes a gentle river flowing through time, carrying you toward peaceful sleep. I'm your narrator for tonight's journey, and I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend these quiet hours with us here on our channel. We believe that the most beautiful stories aren't just fairy tales, but the real tales of human triumph, mystery, and wonder that have shaped our world. Each night, we take you on a different path through time, exploring the forgotten corners of history with a voice as soft as moonlight on ancient stones. Tonight, we travel together to a place where east meets west, with a golden dome of a great cathedral once caught the first rays of dawn over the Bosphorus Strait. We're going to visit an empire that refused to die, a civilization that carried the torch of Rome for over 1,000 years after Rome itself had fallen into shadow. Close your eyes now and let your breathing slow. Feel your shoulders relax, your jaw unclench. Tonight, you don't need to think about tomorrow's concerns or yesterday's worries. Tonight, you are simply here in this moment, ready to drift on the gentle currents of a story that began over 1,500 years ago. Picture yourself standing on a marble terrace overlooking the waters of the Bosphorus. The year is 1450, just 3 years before everything will change forever. The evening air is warm and sweet, with the scent of jasmine from the palace gardens. Below you, the greatest city in the world spreads out like a jeweled carpet, its domes and spires catching the last golden light of day. This is Constantinople, the city of the world's desire, the new Rome, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. 4. Over 1,000 years, this city has stood as a bridge between two worlds, a beacon of learning and faith, a place where the soul of ancient Rome lived on in Greek hearts and Christian prayers. But our story doesn't begin here in these final years. No, to understand the true magic of Byzantium, we must travel back through the mists of time to the moment when the Roman Empire, growing too vast to govern as one, made a decision that would echo through the centuries. The year is 285 A.D. The Roman Empire stretches from Britain to the Euphrates, from the Rhine to the Sahara. It is the largest empire the world has ever known, but it is also an empire in crisis. Barbarian tribes press against its borders like wolves, testing the strength of a fence. Economic troubles strain the treasury. Political instability threatens to tear apart the very fabric of Roman civilization. In this moment of great uncertainty, a man named Diocletian becomes emperor. He is a practical man, a soldier who understands that sometimes the only way to save something precious is to change it completely. Diocletian looks at his vast empire and makes a revolutionary decision. He divides it in two. The western half, centered in Rome, will deal with the barbarian threats in Gaul and Germany. The eastern half, centered in the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, will guard against the Persians and manage the wealthy provinces of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. It seems like a temporary solution, a way to make the empire more manageable, until the crisis passes. But empires, like rivers, have their own will. Once divided, the Roman Empire would never truly be whole again. The Western Empire would struggle against the darkness, fighting battles it would ultimately lose. But the Eastern Empire, the empire we call Byzantine, would discover something unexpected. In becoming half of Rome, it would become something entirely new and entirely its own. As you listen to this story unfold, let your mind wander to those distant shores of the Bosphorus. Feel the evening breeze that once cooled the faces of emperors and empresses, of merchants and monks, of scholars who preserved the wisdom of ages, and artists who created beauty that still takes our breath away. This is the story of Byzantium, the empire that refused to fall, the last light of Rome that burned bright in the east for over 1,000 years. It's a story of magnificent churches and terrible wars, of holy emperors and scheming courtiers, of a civilization that faced impossible odds and survived them all, until finally, on one spring morning in 1453, the light went out. But even then, even in that final moment, Byzantium did not truly die. Its spirit lived on in the Orthodox churches of Russia and the Balkans, in the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, in the paintings of Renaissance artists who learned their craft from Byzantine masters. And tonight, it lives on in our imagination. As we follow the golden thread of this story back through time. So settle deeper into your pillow now. Let the worries of the day drift away like morning mist over the Golden Horn. Tonight, you are safe in the embrace of history, ready to walk the marble halls of the great palace, to hear the chanting of priests in the Hagia Sophia, to witness the rise and fall of the most enduring empire in human history. Our journey begins in the year 330 A.D., when a Roman emperor named Constantine stood on the hills, overlooking the Bosphorus, and decided to build something the world had never seen before. A new Rome, a Christian capital, a city that would be worthy of the empire's greatest dreams. Are you ready to see what Constantine saw? Are you ready to walk where emperors walked, to hear the bells of Byzantium calling across the centuries? Then let us begin our journey together into the heart of the empire that refused to die. The morning sun rises over the hills of Byzantium in the year 324 A.D., painting the waters of the Bosphorus in shades of gold and rose. Standing on these ancient hills is a man who will change the course of history. His name is Constantine, and he is emperor of Rome. But more than that, he is a dreamer, a visionary who sees not just what is, but what could be. Constantine is not the first Roman emperor to recognize the strategic importance of this narrow strait where Europe meets Asia. For centuries, Roman generals have understood that whoever controls the Bosphorus controls the trade. Routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between the wheat fields of Egypt and the markets of Europe. But Constantine sees something more than strategy. He sees destiny. Let your mind drift back to those early morning hours as Constantine walks these hills, his purple cloak stirring in the gentle breeze. Below him, the ancient Greek city of Byzantium spreads along the water's edge its temples, and Agorus bearing witness to 700 years of Greek civilization. But Constantine is looking beyond the present into a future where this modest city will become the greatest metropolis on earth. You see, Constantine carries within him a vision that no Roman emperor before him has ever dared to dream. He envisions a new kind of empire, an empire that will be both Roman and Christian, both ancient and revolutionary. The old Rome, with its pagan temples and republican memories, feels increasingly distant from the Christian emperor's ideals. Here, on this virgin ground where two continents meet, he can build something pure and new. As you listen, feel yourself transported to those planning sessions in Constantine's tent, where architects and engineers spread out their scrolls by lamplight. The emperor points to the narrow neck of land, protected by water on three sides, describing walls that will rise higher than any ever built, harbors that will welcome ships from every corner of the known world, churches that will lift human hearts toward heaven itself. But Constantine's dream is more than architectural. In his mind, this new city will be the capital of a new Rome, a Christian Rome, where the cross and the eagle will fly together over the mightiest empire the world has ever known. He will call it Constantinople, the city of Constantine, but history will know it by many names: the New Rome, the Golden City, the Eye of the World. The construction begins in 324 and continues for 6 years. Imagine the sound of those building years: thousands of hammers ringing against stone, the creak of wooden cranes lifting marble columns into place, the shouts of workers in a dozen languages. Stone comes from quarries across the empire. Columns. They're taken from ancient temples and repurposed for Christian basilicas. Statues that once honored pagan gods are melted down to make Christian vessels. Constantine spares no expense. The new city must rival Rome itself in magnificence. A great hippodrome rises to hold 100,000 spectators. Aqueducts snake across the countryside to bring fresh water from distant springs. Public baths, forums, and palaces spring up along wide, colonnaded streets. And at the heart of it all, Constantine begins construction of the great church, which will later be replaced by the magnificent Hagia Sophia. But even as Constantine builds his dream city, forces are stirring that will ultimately divide the empire he seeks to strengthen. The Roman world has grown too vast, too complex for any single man to govern effectively. Communication across such distances takes weeks or months. Local governors begin to act more like independent rulers than imperial administrators. The very success of Roman conquest has created problems that Roman solutions cannot solve. As you rest in the quiet of this evening, picture the aging Constantine in his final years, walking through the marble halls of his new palace overlooking the Bosphorus. He has achieved something unprecedented. He has moved the center of Roman power eastward without abandoning the West. He has created a Christian capital without destroying pagan Rome. He has built a bridge between two worlds. Constantine dies in 337, just 7 years after the dedication of his new city. His sons inherit an empire that appears united but carries within it the seeds of division. For nearly 60 years, various emperors will struggle to hold East and West together, but the centrifugal forces of distance and difference prove too strong. The final division comes in 395 AD, when Emperor Theodosius I lies dying in Milan. His will divides the Roman Empire between his two young sons. Arcadius, barely 18, will rule the East from Constantinople, while Honorius, only 10 years old, will rule the West from Milan and later Ravenna. Neither son has the strength or wisdom to reunite what their father has divided. This moment, this administrative decision made by a dying emperor, marks the true birth of what we call the Byzantine Empire, though the Eastern emperors will continue to call themselves Roman for another 1,000 years. And though they will maintain Roman law and Roman traditions, something new has been born in Constantinople. A civilization that is Greek in language, Roman in law, and Christian in soul. Listen to the wind blowing across the Bosphorus on that autumn day in 395, when news of Theodosius's death reaches Constantinople. Young Arcadius stands on the palace balcony, looking out over a city that has become the center of his world. He does not yet know that he is the first Byzantine emperor, that the Western Empire will crumble within a century, while his Eastern Empire will endure for more than a millennium. As the years pass, the two halves of the Roman world drift apart like ships on a darkening sea. The West struggles against barbarian invasions, political chaos, and economic collapse. The East, protected by the walls of Constantinople and the waters of the Bosphorus, begins to develop its own character, its own destiny. By 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, is deposed by a German chieftain. The Western Empire is finished. But in Constantinople, the Emperor Zeno still wears the purple, still claims dominion over all Romans everywhere, still dreams of the day when East and West will be reunited under a single crown. That dream of reunification will haunt Byzantine emperors for centuries to come. They will never stop calling themselves Romans, never stop believing that they are the legitimate heirs of Augustus and Trajan. And in a sense, they are right. When the Western Empire falls, Byzantium becomes the last repository of Roman law, Roman culture, Roman ambition. As we conclude this first chapter of our journey, let your thoughts drift to that transformed city by the Bosphorus. In less than 2 centuries, a modest Greek trading post has become the capital of half the Roman world. Constantine's dream has become reality, but like all dreams made manifest, it has taken on a life of its own. The empire that emerges from this division will face challenges that would have amazed Constantine. Persian armies will threaten its eastern borders. Arab conquests will strip away its richest provinces. Crusader armies will one day sack Constantinople itself. But through it all, through triumph and disaster, through glory and humiliation, the Byzantine flame will continue to burn. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, remember this. Every great story begins with a choice. A moment when someone looks at the world as it is and decides to make it something different. Constantine made such a choice when he decided to build anew Rome in the east. Theodosius made another when he divided that empire between his sons. These were not small decisions made by small men. These were world-changing choices that echo through history still. The city Constantine built still stands on the Bosphorus, though it now bears a different name. The empire Theodosius divided shaped the medieval world and influences our own time in ways we are only beginning to understand. Rest now, knowing that tomorrow we will explore the magnificent city that grew from Constantine's dream. We will walk the streets of the greatest metropolis of its age, hear the voices that once filled its forums and churches, witness the daily miracle of a civilization that refused to fade into the shadows of history. Dawn breaks over Constantinople in the year 550 AD, and the city awakens like a living jewel beside the water. From your vantage point on the palace balcony, you can see the entire sweep of this magnificent metropolis spread before you like a vision from a dream. The golden dome of the Hagia Sophia catches the first light, sending rays of brilliance across the red-tiled roofs of 1,000 homes. The morning mist rises from the Bosphorus, wrapping the city in a gossamer veil that makes it seem to float between earth and heaven. Let yourself become part of this awakening city. Listen to the gentle lap of waves against the sea wall, a distant call of muezzins from the few remaining mosques that will not come for centuries yet, the bells of countless churches greeting the dawn with bronze-throated songs of praise. This is Constantinople at its height, a city of 500,000 souls, the largest and most magnificent urban center in the Christian world. Begin your imaginary walk at the great Theodosian walls, those massive fortifications that have protected the city for over a century. These walls rise 40 feet high and stretch for 4 miles across the peninsula, forming an impregnable barrier between Constantinople and the dangers of the landward approach. The walls are triple-layered, with a low outer wall, a higher inner wall, and a series of 96 towers that serve as both defense and symbol of imperial power. As you pass through the Golden Gate, the ceremonial entrance used by triumphant emperors returning from victory, feel the weight of history in these ancient stones. This gate has witnessed the return of countless heroes, the arrival of foreign ambassadors bearing gifts from distant lands, the processions of saints and scholars who have made Constantinople the intellectual center of the world. Walk now along the Mezi, the great colonnaded avenue that runs like a golden spine through the heart of the city. This broad street, paved with marble and lined with shops selling goods from every corner of the known world, connects the imperial palace to the Church of the Holy Apostles. Along its length, you pass forums decorated with statues taken from the greatest cities of the ancient world, fountains that sparkle in the morning light, and basilicas where the faithful gather to pray in Greek, Latin, Armenian, and a dozen other tongues. The sounds of the maze are the sounds of the world itself. Merchants from Egypt hawk papyrus and precious spices. Silk dealers from China display bolts of fabric that shimmer like captured moonlight. Germanic amber, Indian pearls, African ivory, all flow through these streets like tributaries feeding a great river of commerce. The air is rich with the sense of exotic perfumes, fresh bread from the guild bakeries, and the salt tongue of the sea that surrounds the city on 3 sides. Pause for a moment at the Forum of Constantine, where the great porphyry column still stands, bearing on its summit a statue of the city's founder, depicted as the sun god Apollo. Constantine may have been a Christian emperor, but he understood the power of classical symbolism, the way ancient forms could carry new meanings into an uncertain future. Around the base of this column, citizens gather to hear the latest news from the palace, to conduct business, to simply enjoy the companionship of their fellow Romans, for they still call themselves Romans, even though they speak Greek and live 1,000 miles from the Tiber. Continue your walk toward the heart of the city, where the great palace complex sprawls across terraced gardens overlooking the Sea of Marmara. This is not a single building, but a city within a city, a vast collection of halls and chambers, chapels and libraries, workshops and gardens that house the imperial court and the machinery of government. The palace walls are decorated with mosaics that tell the story of imperial victories, biblical scenes, and portraits of saints whose eyes seem to follow you as you pass. Within the palace, in the sacred precincts of the Chrysotriclinos, the golden dining hall where the emperor receives foreign ambassadors, mechanical marvels designed by Byzantine engineers create an atmosphere of otherworldly majesty. Golden lions roar, mechanical birds sing in jeweled trees, and the emperor's throne rises toward the ceiling by hidden mechanisms, lifting the sovereign closer to heaven before the awed eyes of barbarian princes and foreign dignitaries. But the true heart of Constantinople is not the palace or the forums or even the mighty walls. The true heart of the city is the Hippodrome, that vast oval stadium where 250,000 citizens can gather to watch chariot races, to cheer for their favorite teams, and to participate in the closest thing the Byzantine world knows to democracy. Here, the blues and greens, the great circus factions that divide the city's loyalty, compete not just in races, but in elaborate ceremonies that blend sport, politics, and religious devotion. Picture yourself in the Hippodrome on a festival day, surrounded by the roar of the crowd as 8 horses thunder around the spina, the central barrier decorated with ancient obelisks and bronze serpents brought from the conquered cities of the ancient world. The emperor sits in the kathisma, the imperial box, blessing the races with his presence, while his subjects cheer and shout with an enthusiasm that would have amazed their solemn ancestors in Republican Rome. Between the races, the citizens voice their concerns directly to their sovereign. This is the one place in the empire where commoners can speak freely to their emperor, where grievances can be aired and imperial policies debated in the open air. It is a safety valve for the pressures of autocratic rule, a reminder that even absolute power must sometimes bend to the will of the people. As evening approaches, follow the sound of chanting voices to one of the city's hundreds of churches. Constantinople in the 6th century is a city of profound faith, where every neighborhood has its chapel, every guild its patron saint, every family its precious relics and holy icons. The rhythm of daily life is measured not by secular time, but by the liturgical calendar, the cycle of fasts and feasts that connects earthly Constantinople to the celestial Jerusalem. In these churches, you hear the development of a new form of worship, a synthesis of Greek theological sophistication and Roman organizational genius that will become the distinctive liturgy of Eastern Christianity. The chanting that echoes through these sacred spaces is not merely beautiful music, but a form of prayer that lifts the soul toward divine union, a sonic architecture that mirrors the physical architecture of domes and arches reaching toward heaven. And your day's journey at the public baths, those magnificent establishments where citizens of every class gather to cleanse their bodies and refresh their spirits. The baths of Zeuxippus, near the Hippodrome, can accommodate thousands of bathers at once, their halls decorated with statues of philosophers and poets, their pools fed by aqueducts that bring fresh water from springs in the distant hills. Here, in the warm, steamy chambers filled with the sound of flowing water and quiet conversation, you can feel the continuity with ancient Rome, the persistence of classical civilization in this Christian capital. As you settle into the warm water, imagine the conversations that flow around you. Merchants discussing trade routes to distant lands, scholars debating theological questions, courtiers sharing the latest gossip from the palace, ordinary citizens finding respite from their daily labors. This is Constantinople as its people knew it, not just a city of monuments and ceremonies, but a living community, where human lives unfold against the backdrop of empire. The night falls gently over Constantinople, and from your window you can see the city transform into something magical. Lanterns light up in thousands of windows, creating a constellation of earthbound stars. The great lighthouse at the harbor entrance sends its beam across the dark waters, guiding ships home from distant voyages. In the palace, the emperor holds his evening council, making decisions that will affect millions of lives across 3 continents. In the monasteries, monks begin their night vigils, their prayers rising like incense in the darkness. This is the city that will endure for 1,000 years, that will survive Persian invasions and Arab sieges, crusader attacks, and internal rebellions. This is the city that will preserve the wisdom of the ancient world through the darkness of the early medieval period. That will serve as a bridge between East and West, between the classical past and the medieval future. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the image of Constantinople in its golden age, a city where the best of human achievement found expression in stone and gold, in art and learning, in the daily miracle of 500,000 people living together in relative peace and prosperity. Tomorrow, we will meet the emperor who transformed this city into something even more magnificent, who left his mark on law and architecture, on theology and politics, whose reign represents the highest peak of Byzantine achievement. In the hushed moments before dawn, on July 1st, 527 AD, a man named Justinian stands alone in the imperial chapel of the Great Palace, preparing for the ceremony that will make him emperor of the Romans. The flickering candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, and in their gentle light, you can see the determination etched in his weathered face. This is not a man born to purple, not a prince who inherited his throne through bloodline. Justinian is the nephew of Emperor Justin, a peasant, soldier who rose to power through merit and ambition. Now, at the age of 45, Justinian is about to embark on the most ambitious reign in Byzantine history. Let your mind settle into the rhythm of that coronation morning. The great cathedral is filled with the soft rustle of silk robes, whispered prayers of bishops, the distant sound of crowds gathering in the hippodrome to witness their new emperor's accession. As the crown is placed upon Justinian's head, feel the weight of expectations, the burden of dreams that will drive him to attempt what no emperor before him has dared, the restoration of the Roman Empire to its ancient glory. Justinian's dreams are not small dreams. In his mind, he sees Roman legions once again marching through the streets of Rome itself, reclaiming the lost provinces of the West from barbarian kingdoms. He envisions a unified legal code that will govern all Romans, wherever they may live. He imagines churches rising throughout the empire, their domes reaching toward heaven like prayers made manifest in stone. Most of all, he dreams of leaving behind a legacy that will echo through the centuries, a reign that will be remembered as the moment when the Roman Empire was reborn. But no emperor, however great his ambitions, rules alone. Beside Justinian stands a woman whose story is as extraordinary as his own, whose influence on the empire will be profound and lasting. Her name is Theodora, and her path to the throne is a tale that would seem impossible if it were not documented in the historical record. Picture Theodora in her youth, a child of the hippodrome, daughter of a bearkeeper who died when she was young, leaving his family in poverty. She grew up in the world of the circus, that rough and tumble environment where entertainers and athletes lived on the margins of respectable society. She became an actress, a profession that in the 6th century was barely distinguishable from prostitution, performing in the bawdy comedies that delighted the crowds between races. But Theodora possessed something that set her apart from her circumstances: an intelligence as sharp as Damascus steel, a will as unyielding as the walls of Constantinople, and a beauty that could stop conversation in the grandest palaces. When she met Justinian, then heir to the throne, the attraction was immediate and mutual. Against all convention, against the advice of his counselors, against the very laws of the empire that forbade senators from marrying actresses, Justinian chose love over prudence. The night of their wedding, celebrated in the Hagia Sophia before a congregation that included the most powerful nobles of the empire, marked the beginning of one of history's most remarkable partnerships. Theodora did not merely marry an emperor. She became an empress in her own right, a co-ruler whose intelligence and political acumen would prove essential to the success of Justinian's reign. As you rest in the quiet of this evening, imagine the private moments between these two extraordinary people. In the evening hours, when the day's business is done and the courtiers have withdrawn, Justinian and Theodora sit together in their private chambers, planning the campaigns that will reshape the Mediterranean world. She brings to their partnership a shrewd understanding of human nature learned in the hard school of the streets, while he contributes the education and administrative experience that will make their dreams possible. Their first great challenge comes sooner than expected. In January 532, just 5 years into Justinian's reign, the circus factions that usually confine their rivalry to the hippodrome unite in a violent uprising that threatens to topple the government. The Nika riots, named after the victory cry that echoes through the streets, begin as a protest against government policies, but quickly spiral into a full-scale revolution. For 6 days, Constantinople burns. The great cathedral, the palace complex, vast sections of the city center are consumed by flames as rioters demand Justinian's abdication. The emperor's advisors urge him to flee, to take ship for the safety of the provinces, and return when the crisis has passed. But in the palace council chamber, as the sound of the mob grows louder and the glow of fires reddens the sky, Theodora rises to speak words that will echo through history. "Those who have worn the crown," she declares, her voice steady despite the chaos outside, "should never survive its loss. If you wish to flee, Caesar, nothing prevents you. You have money, the ships are ready, the sea is clear. But I shall never see the day when I am not called empress. If you mean to flee, flee then, but I shall stay." In that moment, Theodora transforms from empress to legend, her courage stiffening the resolve of her husband and his generals. The riots are crushed with terrible efficiency. Justinian's general Belisarius traps the rebels in the hippodrome and orders a massacre that leaves 30,000 dead. It is a harsh lesson in the realities of imperial power, but it also frees Justinian to pursue his great ambitions without domestic opposition. With the capital secure, Justinian turns his attention to the great project that will define his reign: the reconquest of the West, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, even distant Spain under its Visigothic rulers, all seen within reach of Byzantine arms. The Eastern Empire is prosperous, its armies are well trained and well equipped, and its enemies are divided and weakened by internal conflicts. The African campaign begins in 533, and its success exceeds even Justinian's optimistic expectations. Belisarius lands in Africa with a relatively small force, and within a year has destroyed the Vandal kingdom, captured the Vandal king, and restored Byzantine control over the richest provinces of North Africa. The victory is so complete that when Belisarius returns to Constantinople, he brings with him not only vast quantities of treasure, but also the Vandal royal family and the sacred vessels of the Temple of Solomon, which the Vandals had taken when they sacked Rome in 455. The triumph celebration that follows is the first held in Constantinople since the city's founding, a deliberate echo of the ancient Roman tradition of honoring victorious generals. As Belisarius parades through the streets, you can almost hear the cheers of the crowd. See the glint of sunlight on captured weapons and golden vessels. Feel the pride of a people who have witnessed their empire's return to greatness. Emboldened by success in Africa, Justinian turns his attention to the even more ambitious project of reconquering Italy. The Gothic wars that follow will last for 20 years and will test the empire's resources to their limits. But in 540, Belisarius enters Rome itself, the first Roman general to do so since the fall of the Western Empire. For a brief, shining moment, it seems as though Justinian's dream of universal Roman rule might actually be achieved. But conquest is only one aspect of Justinian's vision. Even as his armies campaign in distant lands, the emperor is transforming the very foundations of Roman law and administration. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the comprehensive legal code that bears his name, represents one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the ancient world. Working with a team of brilliant jurists led by Tribonian, Justinian creates a systematic compilation of Roman law that will serve as the foundation for legal systems throughout Europe for the next 1,000 years. Picture the quiet dedication of those scholars, working by lamplight in the palace library, sifting through centuries of legal precedents, imperial decrees, and juristic commentaries to create a coherent whole from the chaos of accumulated legislation. The institutes, the digest, the codex, these are not merely legal documents, but monuments to human reason, attempts to create a just society governed by law rather than arbitrary power. But perhaps the most visible and enduring monument to Justinian's reign is not legal but architectural. The great cathedral that bears his name, the Hagia Sophia, rises during these years like a prayer made manifest in stone and gold. We will explore this magnificent building in detail in our next chapter, but for now, simply marvel at the audacity of the vision, a church that will surpass all previous buildings in size and beauty, a structure that will serve as the architectural crown of the empire and the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity. Theodora, meanwhile, pursues her own projects with characteristic energy and determination. She establishes homes for reformed prostitutes, working to give women trapped in circumstances like her own youthful situation a chance for a different life. She influences imperial policy on religious matters, protecting the Monophysite Christians who deny the orthodox position on Christ's nature. She builds churches, sponsors charitable works, and serves as a patron to scholars and artists throughout the empire. The partnership between Justinian and Theodora reaches its zenith in the 540s, when Byzantine power extends from the Danube to the Nile, from the Euphrates to the Atlantic. But even at this moment of triumph, shadows are gathering. The plague that historians will call the Justinian Plague sweeps through the empire, killing perhaps a third of the population and devastating the economy. Persian armies invade the eastern provinces, forcing Justinian to fight on multiple fronts. The Italian campaign becomes a grinding war of attrition that drains the treasury and exhausts the empire's military resources. In 548, Theodora dies, probably of cancer, leaving Justinian to face the final years of his reign without the partner who had been his closest advisor and most trusted confidant. The emperor, now in his 60s, continues to rule for another 17 years, but the dynamic energy of the early reign is gone. The dream of universal Roman rule proves impossible to sustain, and one by one, the Western conquests are lost to new barbarian invasions. When Justinian dies in 565, he leaves behind an empire that is still powerful, but no longer expanding. Still, wealthy but no longer growing, still magnificent but bearing the scars of overambition. Yet his legacy endures in ways that his contemporaries could not have imagined. The legal code that bears his name will influence European law for centuries to come. The architectural innovations of his reign will inspire builders from Russia to Spain. The administrative reforms he implements will help the empire survive the disasters that follow his death. Most importantly, Justinian and Theodora demonstrate that extraordinary people can rise from the humblest circumstances to achieve greatness, that love and partnership can triumph over prejudice and convention, that human ambition, even when it falls short of its ultimate goals, can leave the world a richer and more beautiful place. As you prepare for sleep tonight, think of Justinian. In his final years, walking alone through the corridors of the great palace, remembering the days when he and Theodora planned to conquer the world. He has not achieved everything he dreamed, but he has achieved something perhaps more valuable. He has shown that the Roman Empire can be reborn, that the ancient virtues of justice and beauty and learning can flourish in a Christian age, that, even in a world of barbarian kingdoms and religious divisions, the light of civilization can burn bright and steady. Tomorrow, we will explore the greatest monument to that light, the church that Justinian built to be the wonder of the world. The Hagia Sophia, where heaven and earth meet in perfect harmony beneath a dome that seems to float on beams of golden light. The year is 532, and Constantinople lies wounded beneath a winter sky. The great Nika riots have torn through the heart of the city like a fever, leaving behind charred ruins and broken dreams. Where once stood the old Hagia Sophia, that humble church of wood and simple stone, now only blackened timbers and scattered ashes remain. The air still carries the acrid scent of smoke, and citizens walk with lowered heads through streets that echo with the memory of violence. But Emperor Justinian stands differently among these ruins. His purple cloak moves softly in the cold wind as he surveys the devastation, and beside him, Empress Theodora's dark eyes reflect not despair, but fierce determination. They are not seeing what was destroyed, but rather what could be born from these ashes. In this moment of apparent defeat, they are dreaming of something that has never existed before on earth. Justinian's voice cuts through the winter air, calm and resolute. He speaks to two men who have journeyed from across the empire to stand beside him in this desolate place. Anthemius of Tralles, the brilliant mathematician whose mind moves like quicksilver through problems of space and light, nods slowly as he listens to the emperor's vision. Beside him, Isidore of Miletus, the master engineer who can make stone, dance to his will, begins to see possibilities taking shape in the empty air above the ruins. The emperor's words paint pictures that seem impossible. He speaks of a dome larger than any ever built, floating above the earth as if held aloft by angels themselves. He describes light pouring down from heaven through windows arranged like a crown of stars. His hands move through the air, sketching invisible arches and soaring spaces, and slowly the two architects begin to understand that they are being asked to build not just a church, but a bridge between earth and paradise. As winter melts into spring, the great work begins. The sound of Constantinople changes, filling with the rhythm of 10,000 workers who move with purpose through the dawning streets. Ships arrive daily at the harbors, their holds heavy with treasures gathered from every corner of the known world. Purple marble from the mountains of Thessaly, where dawn first touches the peaks, is unloaded with reverent care. Green marble from Laconia arrives like captured forest shadows, while golden stones from Libya carry within them the warmth of desert sands. The foundation trenches grow deeper each day, reaching down toward the bedrock as if seeking the very bones of the earth. Each massive stone is positioned with the precision of prayer, for the workers understand they are not merely building another church. They are crafting something that will stand as proof that mortal hands can indeed touch the divine. The sound of chisels on stone creates a constant music throughout the construction site, punctuated by the calls of craftsmen and the creak of wooden cranes lifting blocks toward the sky. Anthemius moves through this controlled chaos like a conductor guiding an orchestra of stone and timber. His calculations dance through problems that have never been solved before, his mind working to achieve what seems impossible. How do you suspend the largest dome ever conceived without the massive supporting walls that previous builders had? Required? The answer emerges slowly, elegantly, in the form of those revolutionary pendentives that will cradle the dome's weight and transfer it gracefully downward to 4 great pillars. As summer arrives, the walls begin their climb toward heaven. The great arches take shape, curving upward with mathematical precision, yet somehow appearing as natural as the arc of a bird's wing. Ancient columns, carried from temples across the empire, find new purpose here. 8 magnificent pillars of green marble from Ephesus rise to support the galleries, while others from the Temple of the Sun in Rome stand ready to bear witness to this new chapter in their eternal story. The work continues through the heat of summer and into autumn's golden light. Workers begin each day before dawn, their movements becoming ritual as sacred as any ceremony. The building grows not just in height, but in presence, developing a character that seems almost alive. Visitors to the construction site speak in hushed tones of how the structure breathes, how its arches sway with supple strength rather than rigid resistance, how it seems to welcome rather than merely shelter. The great moment approaches with Ur's return. The dome itself is ready to be raised, that miraculous circle of stone and light that will crown their achievement. The workers gather in respectful silence as the final keystone is prepared for placement. This single stone will lock together the entire dome, holding 31 meters of carefully calculated masonry suspended in space above their heads. The diameter stretches nearly as wide as Rome's great Pantheon, yet this dome will be different, pierced with 40 windows that will transform solid stone into a ring of pure light. The keystone slides into position with a sound like a great bell settling into silence. A moment passes, then another, as everyone holds their breath. The dome holds. It stands. It soars. A cheer rises from the assembled workers, but it quickly fades into something deeper than celebration, something closer to awe. They have done the impossible. They have captured a piece of heaven and suspended it above the earth. Winter passes into spring, and spring into summer, as the interior work continues. Craftsmen begin the delicate task of covering the raw stone with sheets of precious marble, creating surfaces that will catch and hold light like pools of liquid gold. The floors receive their patterns of geometric perfection, while columns are polished until they gleam like mirrors, reflecting the growing beauty all around them. December 27, 537, dawns clear and cold over the Bosphorus. This is the day Justinian has waited for through 5 years and 10 months of dreams made manifest. He approaches the great bronze doors of his completed cathedral with steps that seem almost reluctant, as if he fears that entering too quickly might somehow break the spell. The doors swing open with barely a whisper, and the emperor steps into what he has wrought. Light floods down from the dome's windows like a waterfall of liquid gold, illuminating an interior that seems to exist somewhere between earth and eternity. The great space stretches away in all directions, yet somehow feels intimate, welcoming, sacred. The dome floats overhead, so perfectly proportioned that it appears weightless, held aloft by nothing more substantial than prayer and starlight. The 6-winged seraphim gaze down from the pendentives with golden eyes that seem to blink in the shifting light. Justinian raises his arms toward the floating dome, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space as he speaks words that history will remember. Solomon, I have surpassed you. The declaration echoes once, twice, and fades into a silence that seems to hold all the prayers that will ever be spoken within these walls. As evening approaches, the character of the space transforms completely. Oil lamps suspended on silver. Chains begin to glow throughout the nave, creating pools of warm amber light. The marble surfaces, so bright and reflective during the day, now seem to breathe with inner fire. The dome, darker now against the evening sky, appears to recede into infinite space, as if the ceiling has simply vanished to reveal the star-scattered heavens above. Night settles over Constantinople, and the great cathedral prepares for its first rest. The last of the oil lamps are extinguished, the bronze doors are sealed, and Hagia Sophia settles into the profound silence that will become its evening prayer. The marble cools with tiny whispers. The dome adjusts to the night air with barely audible creaks, and the ancient stones begin their eternal conversation with the darkness. In this quiet hour, the building reveals its deepest mystery. It is not merely an achievement of architecture or engineering, not simply the largest dome ever built, or the most ingenious use of light and space. Hagia Sophia has become something more than the sum of its stones and mortar, its marble and gold. It has become a living prayer, a bridge between the earthly empire of Byzantium and the eternal kingdom of heaven, a place where the impossible has been made real through human hands, guided by divine inspiration. The dome dreams on through the Byzantine night, suspended between earth and sky, holding within its golden embrace all the hopes and prayers of an empire that refuses to fade. In the darkness, it waits patiently for tomorrow's dawn, when light will once again pour through its windows and transform stone into something approaching paradise. This is Hagia Sophia, the holy wisdom, the crown jewel of Byzantium, the dome of heaven-made stone, and it stands ready now to shelter the faithful for centuries yet to come. The golden dawn light streaming through Hagia Sophia's windows reveals something extraordinary happening to the walls themselves. What appeared as simple marble surfaces in the darkness now comes alive with thousands upon thousands of tiny squares of colored glass and gold, each no larger than a child's fingernail, yet together creating images that seem to breathe with divine life. These are the mosaics of Byzantium, and they represent far more than mere decoration. They are windows to heaven, prayers made visible, theology written in light and color. Brother Methodius, a young monk from the monastery of Studios, approaches one of these glowing walls with reverent steps. His sandals whisper against the marble floor as he carries his basket of tools and precious materials. In his weathered hands, he holds tiny cubes of glass called tesserae, some clear as mountain water, others deep blue as the midnight sky, and many covered with the thinnest possible layer of gold leaf that catches every ray of light like captured starfire. He has been summoned to help create something that has never existed before in Christian art, something that will transform how believers understand the very nature of divine presence. The commission comes from Emperor Justinian himself, who, in visions, covering the interior of his great cathedral with images that will serve as a bridge between the earthly congregation and the heavenly court. These are not to be simple paintings that might fade with time, but permanent visions crafted from materials that will endure for centuries. Each mosaic will be carefully planned by theologians and artists working together, ensuring that every gesture, every color, every fold of drapery carries precise spiritual meaning. Brother Methodius begins his work before sunrise, when the cathedral stands empty except for the whispered prayers of the night vigil. He climbs the wooden scaffolding that rises against the eastern apse, where the most important mosaic of all will take shape. Here, in the curved space behind the altar, Christ, Pantocrator, the ruler of all, will gaze down upon the faithful with eyes that seem to see into every soul. The monk's first task is to prepare the surface, applying layer after layer of lime plaster mixed with marble dust, creating a smooth foundation that will hold the tiny glass pieces for generations to come. As the plaster dries to the perfect consistency, neither too wet nor too dry, Brother Methodius begins to transfer the cartoon, the detailed drawing that will guide his work. With careful strokes of charcoal, he outlines the majestic figure of Christ, his right hand raised in blessing, his left holding a jeweled gospel book. Every line must be perfect, for this image will be seen and venerated by thousands of pilgrims who will journey to Constantinople from the farthest reaches of the Christian world. The work proceeds with meditative slowness. Each tessera must be selected for its exact shade and luminosity, then set at precisely the right angle to catch and reflect the light streaming down from the great dome above. The face of Christ emerges gradually, created not with the smooth gradations of painting, but with thousands of individual points of light that seem to shimmer with inner life. The eyes, those all-seeing eyes that will become legendary throughout the Orthodox world, require special attention. Brother Methodius uses the darkest blue glass for the pupils, surrounded by rings of lighter blue and gray, with touches of white gloss to create highlights that make the eyes appear to move and blink as viewers shift their position below. Word of the extraordinary work spreads throughout Constantinople, and soon other craftsmen arrive to join the great project. From Ravenna comes Master Apollodorus, whose mosaics in the Church of San Vitale have made him famous throughout Italy. He brings with him techniques learned from generations of Byzantine artists, methods for creating the flowing drapery that seems to move in an invisible divine wind, the golden halos that float like crowns of light around sacred heads, the architectural backgrounds that suggest heavenly palaces beyond mortal imagination. Working alongside the master craftsmen are younger apprentices, many of them monks like Methodius, who have dedicated their lives to this sacred art. They learn to read the subtle language of mosaic composition, understanding that gold backgrounds represent the eternal light of heaven, that blue symbolizes the divine nature of Christ, that purple indicates imperial dignity, and that white suggests purity and resurrection. Every color choice becomes a theological decision, every artistic element a form of visual prayer. As spring turns to summer, the apse mosaic nears completion, and Brother Methodius begins work on the surrounding areas. The archangels Michael and Gabriel take shape in the spandrels, their wings spread wide in eternal vigilance, their faces bearing expressions of serene authority. Below them, a procession of saints and martyrs begins to march across the walls, each figure individualized, yet unified in their common devotion to the divine presence above. The technique itself becomes a form of meditation. The repetitive placement of thousands of tiny pieces creates a rhythm not unlike the chanting of psalms, and many of the craftsmen report experiencing visions and moments of divine inspiration as they work. The mosaics seem to collaborate in their own creation, guiding the hands of their makers toward combinations of color and light that transcend mere human artistry. In the monasteries around Constantinople, other monks are creating smaller but equally significant works. Icons, those portable windows to heaven, emerge from workshops where the same mosaic techniques are applied to wooden panels covered with ivory, precious metals, and enamel. These images serve a different purpose from the great church mosaics, providing intimate focal points for personal prayer and meditation. Yet they follow the same theological principles, the same careful attention to spiritual symbolism and divine proportion. Brother Methodius often pauses in his work to contemplate the deeper meaning of what he is creating. These are not mere representations of holy figures, but actual presences, spiritual windows through which the faithful can commune with the saints and angels of heaven. The mosaics serve as a form of visual theology, teaching illiterate believers the stories and doctrines of their faith through images more powerful than any sermon. A peasant who cannot read can nonetheless understand the mercy in Christ's eyes, the protective strength in the archangel's bearing, the joy of the saints who have achieved eternal life. As autumn arrives, the great work approaches completion. The interior of Hagia Sophia has been transformed into something that exists nowhere else on earth, a space where every surface glows with divine light and sacred presence. The mosaics work together with the architecture to create an environment that seems to lift the soul directly into the presence of God. Visitors enter through the great bronze doors and immediately feel themselves transported beyond the ordinary world into a realm where heaven and earth interpenetrate. The final tessera is set in place on a December morning when snow falls gently over Constantinople. Brother Methodius descends from his scaffolding for the last time, his hands stained with lime and gold dust, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of work completed in service to the Almighty. The mosaics that he and his fellow craftsmen have created will outlast empires, surviving invasions and iconoclastic controversies, earthquakes and political upheavals, bearing witness across the centuries to the faith and artistic genius of Byzantium. As evening approaches and the lamps are lit throughout the cathedral, the mosaics reveal their true magic. The flickering flame light transforms the static images into living presences that seem to move and breathe in the golden glow. Christ's blessing hand appears to move in slow benediction. The angels' wings flutter with supernatural life, and the saints' faces turn toward the congregation with expressions of infinite compassion and understanding. The faithful who gather for evening prayers find themselves surrounded by the communion of saints. The great cloud of witnesses that Orthodox theology teaches hovers always near the earthly church. The mosaics make this invisible reality visible, creating a sacred space where the boundaries between time and eternity, earth and heaven, mortal and divine become beautifully, mysteriously blurred. This is the true achievement of Byzantine mosaic art, not merely the creation of beautiful decoration, but the fashioning of actual doorways to the sacred, windows through which the divine light can shine into the world of fall. Human hearts. In the quiet hours after the last prayer has been sung, and the cathedral doors have been sealed for the night, the mosaics continue their silent vigil. The gold tessera catch and hold even the faintest starlight filtering through the great dome's windows, creating a gentle glow that suggests the never-ending light of eternity. These images, born from the faith and skill of Byzantine craftsmen, stand ready to inspire and comfort countless generations of believers yet to come, bearing witness to the beauty and mystery of divine love made visible through human hands guided by heavenly inspiration. The golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia that we witnessed taking shape in Brother Methodius's gentle hands would not shine undisturbed for long. By the year 726, nearly 2 centuries after Justinian's great cathedral first opened its doors to worshippers, a shadow was growing across the Byzantine Empire, cast not by foreign invaders or natural disasters, but by a theological storm that would tear the very soul of Eastern Christianity apart. This was the beginning of the great iconoclastic controversy, a conflict that would rage for more than a century and transform the empire's understanding of divine presence, imperial power, and the nature of sacred art itself. Emperor Leo III, known to history as Leo the Isaurian, stands before the magnificent mosaic of Christ Pantocrator in Hagia Sophia on a morning that will change everything. A Syrian-born emperor who had saved Constantinople from Arab siege and proven himself a brilliant military commander, now faces a different kind of battle entirely. In his weathered hands, he holds not a sword, but a theological treatise, and in his eyes burns not the fire of conquest, but the passion of religious conviction. He has come to believe, with the certainty that only zealots possess, that the beautiful images surrounding him are not windows to heaven, but barriers to true faith, not aids to worship, but obstacles to salvation. The emperor's transformation began slowly, fed by influences that came from the Islamic world that pressed so persistently against Byzantium's borders. In the lands where Leo had spent his youth, he had observed how the followers of Muhammad rejected all religious imagery as idolatrous, how they found spiritual purity in geometric patterns and flowing calligraphy rather than human faces and divine forms. When volcanic eruptions shook the Aegean islands and earthquakes toppled cities across Anatolia, Leo began to interpret these disasters not as random acts of nature, but as divine punishment for the empire's supposed sin of icon worship. Standing now before the mosaic Christ, whose eyes seem to follow every movement, Leo speaks words that will echo through history with devastating consequence. He declares that the making and veneration of religious images constitutes idolatry, a violation of the second commandment that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. The beautiful works that Brother Methodius and countless other craftsmen had created with such devotion and skill are now condemned as blasphemous creations that lead the faithful away from true spiritual worship toward superstitious material attachment. The emperor's first public act of iconoclasm comes with shocking swiftness. On that fateful morning in 726, imperial soldiers appear at the bronze gate of the great palace, carrying ladders and hammers. Their target is the golden image of Christ that has blessed all who enter the palace grounds for generations. As crowds gather in horror and disbelief, the soldiers begin their work of destruction, prying away the precious tessera one by one, reducing centuries of artistic devotion to rubble and fragments. When a group of women attempt to intervene, trying to protect the sacred image with their bodies, several are killed in the resulting confrontation, becoming the first martyrs of the iconoclastic age. Word of the emperor's actions spreads through Constantinople like wildfire, dividing the population into two passionate camps. The iconoclasts, who support Leo's position, argue that true Christian worship should be directed toward God alone, unmediated by material representations that can only diminish and distort divine reality. They point to the early Christian rejection of pagan idols and claim that Byzantine icon veneration has fallen into the same spiritual error. Many of them are soldiers and government officials who see practical advantages in supporting imperial policy, but others are genuinely convinced that they are purifying Christianity of corrupting influences. The iconophiles, those who defend the sacred images, respond with equal fervor and conviction. Led by monks, theologians, and artists who have devoted their lives to creating and contemplating these works of spiritual beauty, they argue that icons serve not as objects of worship, but as channels of divine grace, windows through which the faithful can commune with Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. They invoke the doctrine of the Incarnation itself, arguing that when God became human in the person of Jesus Christ, he sanctified not only human nature, but human art's capacity to represent divine reality. Patriarch Germanos of Constantinople, the highest-ranking clergyman in the Eastern Church, finds himself caught between his theological convictions and his loyalty to the emperor. In the patriarch's private chambers, late at night when the city sleeps uneasily around him, he wrestles with questions that have no easy answers. How can he balance his duty to imperial authority with his responsibility to preserve the traditions handed down from the apostles themselves? When Leo demands that he publicly support the iconoclastic position, Germanos chooses conscience over comfort, refusing to condemn practices that he believes are rooted in authentic Christian tradition. His defiance costs him his position, and he is forced into retirement, replaced by a more compliant cleric who will support imperial policy. The resistance to iconoclasm proves strongest in the monasteries that dot the hills around Constantinople and spread across the empire's territories. In the monastery of Studios, where Brother Methodius once learned his craft, monks hide precious icons in secret chambers, burying them like treasures, against the day when sanity might return to imperial policy. They understand that they are preserving not merely beautiful objects, but tangible connections to centuries of Christian devotion, links in an unbroken chain that stretches back to the earliest disciples who first dared to represent the face of their risen Lord. The iconoclastic campaign intensifies under Leo's son and successor, Constantine V, who earns the bitter nickname Copernemos, meaning named after dung, from his opponents, who see him as defiling everything sacred in Byzantine Christianity. Constantine proves even more zealous than his father, launching violent persecution of the monastic clergy, who remain the foremost defenders of icon veneration. Monks are forced to march through the hippodrome, holding hands with women, mocking their vows of celibacy, while others are imprisoned, exiled, or executed for refusing to abandon their sacred images. In 754, Constantine convenes a church council at Hieria, a palace in a Constantinople suburb, where carefully selected bishops formally condemn religious images as contrary to Christian doctrine. The council's pronouncements carry the weight of imperial authority, but they lack the broader acceptance that would give them lasting theological validity. Many bishops boycott the gathering entirely, while others attend only under coercion, their signatures extracted through pressure rather than conviction. The destruction spreads throughout the empire like a fever. In churches across Anatolia and the Balkans, imperial agents arrive with chisels and whitewash, methodically destroying centuries of artistic achievement. The beautiful mosaics are replaced with plain crosses, one of the few symbols the iconoclastic state permits, while painted walls are covered with geometric patterns that echo Islamic artistic traditions. Libraries are searched for illuminated manuscripts, their painted miniatures scraped away or burned entirely. The artistic treasures that had made Byzantine civilization a beacon of beauty in a turbulent world vanish under the systematic campaign of religiously motivated destruction. Yet, resistance continues, often in the most unlikely places. In remote mountain hideaways and island monasteries, monks continue creating icons in secret, developing new techniques for concealing their work when imperial inspectors arrive. Women play a crucial role in preserving the iconophile tradition, hiding precious images in their homes and passing down stories of their meaning to children who might someday see the restoration of these beloved practices. Even in the imperial court itself, some courtiers secretly maintain private collections of icons, keeping alive the artistic traditions that official policy condemns. The theological debate deepens and intensifies as both sides develop increasingly sophisticated arguments for their positions. Iconoclastic theologians like Constantine V himself write treatises arguing that any attempt to represent divine reality in material form inevitably diminishes and falsifies that reality, creating idols that compete with God for human devotion. They point to the mystery of divine transcendence, arguing that the Almighty cannot be captured or contained in human art without being reduced to merely human dimensions. The iconophile response, developed in the writings of monks like John of Damascus, who lived safely in Muslim territory beyond imperial reach, offers a more nuanced understanding of how images function in Christian worship. They distinguish carefully between worship, which belongs to God alone, and veneration, a lesser form of honor that can appropriately be given to representations of holy persons and events. They argue that icons serve as books for the illiterate, teaching the stories of faith to those who cannot read Scripture, and as focal points for prayer that help the mind ascend from material to spiritual realities. As the 8th century draws toward its close, the empire bears deep scars from this theological civil war. Families have been divided, friendships destroyed, and artistic traditions that took centuries to develop have been swept away in a generation. The iconoclastic emperors, convinced that they are purifying Christianity, and strengthening the empire. Against its enemies, have instead created divisions that will never fully heal. The Muslim armies they hope to appease through the elimination of religious images continue their attacks, while the Pope in Rome, horrified by the destruction of sacred art, begins to distance himself from Constantinople and look westward for military and political alliances. Yet through all this turmoil, the essential spirit of Byzantine Christianity endures. In hidden chambers and secret hearts, the tradition of sacred art survives, waiting for the day when it can emerge once again into the light. The icons may be banned and destroyed, but the theological insights they embodied, the spiritual experiences they facilitated, and the artistic techniques they preserved remain alive in the memories and skills of those who refuse to abandon their ancestral faith. As night falls over a Constantinople scarred by religious conflict, the great dome of Hagia Sophia still rises against the stars, but its interior tells a different story now. Where once Christ Pantocrator gazed down with eyes of infinite mercy, plain crosses mark the spots where mosaics were chiseled away. The building itself survives, magnificent as ever, but something precious has been lost, something that will take decades to recover and centuries to fully heal. This is the price of fanaticism, the cost of religious certainty that admits no room for beauty, mystery, or the ancient wisdom that saw in human art not competition with divine reality, but humble cooperation with the creative power that made all things beautiful in their time. The gentle evening breeze carries with it whispers from across the centuries, and as we settle deeper into our journey through time, we find ourselves standing once again upon the great walls of Constantinople. The moon casts long shadows across the battlements, and in this peaceful moment, we must speak of storms that gathered on distant horizons. For you see, dear listener, the Byzantine Empire was like a magnificent lighthouse standing proud upon a rocky shore, its beacon shining bright across the dark waters of history. But around this lighthouse, three great storms were always brewing, three mighty forces that circled like wolves in the night, waiting for any sign of weakness. Close your eyes now, and let us travel together to understand the delicate dance of survival that the Byzantines performed for over 1,000 years, surrounded on all sides by powers that sought to extinguish their light. To the east, beyond the mountains of Armenia and the vast plains of Mesopotamia, there stood an empire as old and proud as Rome itself. The Sassanid Persian Empire, with its capital at Ctesiphon, had been locked in an eternal struggle with Rome for centuries before Constantinople ever drew breath. Picture, if you will, the court of the Persian Shah, resplendent in silk and gold, where Zoroastrian fire altars burned eternally, and the ancient wisdom of Persia flowed like honey from the tongues of wise men. This was no barbarous kingdom, but a sophisticated civilization that considered itself the equal of Rome in every way. The Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628 A.D. was the culmination of hundreds of years of conflict between the Romans and the powerful kingdoms of Persia. For the Byzantines, the Persians represented not just a military threat, but a philosophical challenge. Two great empires, two interpretations of divine rule, two visions of how the world should be ordered. The Persian kings, those who called themselves Shahanshah, King of Kings, saw the Roman Empire as an upstart pretender. After all, their civilization traced its roots back to Cyrus the Great, to Darius, to the builders of Persepolis. They remembered when Alexander had burned their sacred city, and they had never forgiven the West for that ancient wound. When the conflict reignited in the early 7th century CE, the Sassanians nearly succeeded in destroying the Byzantine Empire. It was only with the rise of the great soldier Emperor Heraclius, c. 575 to 641 CE, and the use of clever diplomacy that the Byzantines were able to emerge victorious. Imagine Emperor Heraclius in his darkest hour, When Persian armies had captured Jerusalem itself, carrying away the true cross, that most sacred relic of Christianity, the empire's treasury was empty. The people were in despair, and it seemed as though the ancient prophecies of Daniel were coming to pass. Yet in that darkness, the emperor found the strength to transform himself from an administrator into a warrior saint. The campaigns that followed were like something from an epic poem. Heraclius himself led his armies across the Armenian highlands, through valleys where the morning mist clung to ancient battlefields. A coalition of Avars, Slavs, and Sassanid Persians attacked, while Heraclius campaigned in the east. The successful defense, bolstered by divine favor and a naval victory on the Golden Horn, was seen as a miracle and reinforced the city's mythic invincibility. But even as Constantinople's walls held firm and Heraclius won his great victories, both empires were bleeding. The long war had drained their treasuries, exhausted their armies, and left their borders vulnerable to a threat that neither Persian nor Byzantine truly saw coming. From the south, from the endless deserts where only the hardiest of peoples could survive, came a force that would change the world forever. The Arab tribes, united under the banner of a new faith called Islam, moved with the speed of desert winds and the unstoppable force of a sandstorm. The only dangers expected from the south were occasional raids by nomadic Arab tribesmen. Both empires therefore allied themselves with small, semi-independent Arab principalities, which served as buffer states and protected Byzantium and Persia from Bedouin attacks. How peaceful that sounds now in our quiet evening reverie. Occasional raids, buffer states. The great empires had grown so accustomed to their ancient rivalry that they barely noticed the transformation taking place in the Arabian Peninsula. They saw only scattered tribes, desert nomads who might occasionally trouble their southern borders. But these were no longer the divided tribes of old. Under the Prophet Muhammad and his successors, the Arabs had found unity, purpose, and an unshakable belief in their divine mission. They moved not as raiders seeking plunder, but as believers carrying a message they were convinced would transform the world. The first engagements may have started as conflicts with the Arab, client states of the Byzantine and Sassanid empires, the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids of Al-Hawira. In any case, Muslim Arabs after 634 certainly pursued a full-blown offensive against both empires, resulting in the conquest of vast territories that had been Roman and Persian for centuries. Picture the Byzantine garrison commander at Damascus, awakening one morning to reports that seemed impossible. Arab armies, not raiding parties but entire armies, were crossing the Jordan River. The old world was ending, and a new one was being born in the crucible of conquest. The tragedy was exquisite in its irony. Heraclius, the hero emperor who had saved Constantinople from the Persians, lived to see his greatest victories turn to ash. The provinces he had fought so hard to liberate from Persian rule, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, fell one by one to the Arab armies. The true cross, recovered at such cost from the Persians, was lost again as Jerusalem opened its gates to the Caliph Omar. Yet even in this seeming disaster, we can see the resilience that would define Byzantine civilization. The empire did not collapse, it transformed. It learned to live with loss, to find strength in adversity, to build new glories from the ashes of old defeats. The third threat that encircled Byzantium came from the most unexpected direction of all. From the west, from the lands that had once been part of the same Roman Empire, came a danger that cut deeper than any Persian sword or Arab scimitar. The Latin West, centered now in Rome under the authority of the Pope, had grown increasingly suspicious of their Eastern brothers. Theological disputes that had once been settled in council now festered like wounds that would not heal. Questions of doctrine, of authority, of the very nature of Christ himself, divided Christian from Christian. The Byzantines saw themselves as the true heirs of Rome, the guardians of Orthodox Christianity, the keepers of the ancient traditions. But in the West, a different vision was taking shape. The Pope claimed universal authority over all Christians, while the Holy Roman Emperor sought to recreate Charlemagne's Western Empire. These divisions might have remained merely theological, debated in monasteries and argued in synods. But the emergence of the crusading movement transformed religious difference into military threat. The very people who should have been Byzantium's natural allies in the struggle against Islam became, instead, another enemy to fear. The irony was bitter beyond words. As Muslim armies pressed against Byzantium's eastern borders, as Arab fleets threatened her coasts, the empire found herself facing hostility from her fellow Christians in the West. The unity of Christendom, that great dream of the early church fathers, lay shattered like a beautiful vase dropped upon stone floors. In the quietness of this evening hour, we can perhaps understand the extraordinary skill with which Byzantine diplomats and emperors navigated these treacherous waters. Surrounded by three great powers, each capable of destroying the empire if given the chance, Byzantium survived through cunning, flexibility, and an almost supernatural ability to turn enemies into allies and allies into tools. Consider the complex chess game that Byzantine foreign policy became. An alliance with the Franks against the Arabs might be necessary 1 year, only to be replaced by cooperation with Arab Emirates against Norman invaders the next. Treaties were signed and broken, marriages arranged and dissolved, all in service of the empire's survival. The Sasanians were further weakened by economic decline. Heavy taxation to finance Khosrow II's campaigns, religious unrest, and the increasing power of the provincial landholders at the expense of the Shah. The Byzantines learned to watch for such signs of weakness in all their enemies, ready to exploit any advantage while never forgetting that today's opportunity might become tomorrow's threat. Sometimes the empire played its enemies against each other, encouraging Arab raids on Norman holdings in Sicily while secretly negotiating with Norman princes about joint ventures against Arab pirates. Other times, Byzantium stood alone, her armies and fleets the only shield between Christian Europe and Islamic conquest. As we sit here in the gentle darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, we can almost hear the conversations that echoed through the halls of the great palace in Constantinople. The emperor's council meeting by candlelight, reading reports from spies and ambassadors, trying to discern which of their many enemies posed the greatest immediate threat. Should they reinforce the eastern themes against an Arab offensive, or send the fleet west to counter Norman expansion? Should they negotiate with the Pope, risking accusations of heresy from their own clergy, or maintain theological purity while facing isolation? Every decision carried the weight of the empire's survival. Yet in all this complexity, all this danger, there was also beauty. The very fact that Byzantium survived for 1,000 years while surrounded by such powerful enemies speaks to something profound in the human spirit. It shows us that civilization can endure even in the most difficult circumstances, that culture and learning can flourish even under the shadow of constant threat. The mosaics in Hagia Sophia continued to gleam with golden light even as armies marched and retreated across Anatolia. Scholars copied ancient manuscripts even as foreign fleets appeared on the horizon. Mothers sang lullabies to their children even as the walls of their cities groaned under siege. This is perhaps the most beautiful lesson of all, that life continues, that hope endures, that the human heart finds ways to create beauty even in the midst of struggle. The Byzantine Empire was never just a political entity. It was a testament to the power of persistence, the strength that comes from holding fast to one's deepest beliefs, while remaining flexible enough to survive in a changing world. As we prepare to move forward in our journey through Byzantine history, let us carry with us this image of the empire as a beacon lighthouse, standing firm against three great storms. Sometimes the light flickered, sometimes the waves crashed over the rocks below, but the light never went out. The beacon of Byzantium would shine for another 8 centuries after the great crisis of the 7th century, its light guiding travelers through the darkness of the medieval world. And even when at last that light was extinguished, its glow would live on in the memory of all who had seen it, a reminder that empires may fall, but the human spirit endures forever. Let that thought comfort you now as you drift toward peaceful sleep, knowing that somewhere in the depths of history that lighthouse still stands, its beacon still burning bright in the darkness of time. The night grows deeper now, and as we continue our gentle journey through the corridors of time, we must speak of one of history's most tragic betrayals. Settle back into your comfortable place, dear listener, and let your breathing slow as we approach perhaps the darkest chapter in Byzantium's long story. Sometimes the cruelest wounds come not from sworn enemies, but from those we trust most deeply. Sometimes the sharpest blade is wielded not by a stranger's hand, but by someone who once called us brother. This is the story of such a wound inflicted upon Constantinople in the year 1204, a wound so deep that it never truly healed. The year was 1198, and across Western Europe, a new pope had ascended to the throne of St. Peter. Innocent III was young, brilliant, and filled with a burning vision of Christian unity. He dreamed of another great crusade, one that would finally reclaim Jerusalem from the forces of Islam and restore the Holy Land to Christian rule. Picture the scene, if you will, as word of this new crusade spread through the courts and castles of France, Germany, and Italy. In the great halls where tapestries depicted scenes of Roland's horn at Roncesvalles, where troubadours sang of Charlemagne's victories, noble knights heard the call and felt their hearts stir with visions of glory and salvation. This would be the Fourth Crusade, and unlike its predecessors, it would approach the Holy Land not by the dangerous overland route through Byzantine territory, but by sea. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Gather the flower of Western knighthood, charter ships from the maritime Republic of Venice, sail directly to Egypt, and strike at the heart of Muslim power. But plans, as you well know from your own life's journey, have a way of changing. And the changes that befell this crusade would echo through the centuries like thunder rolling across distant mountains. Asterisk in the bustling ports of Venice, where the scent of exotic spices mingled with the salt. Air and the cries of merchants hawking their wares filled the morning light. An old and cunning doge held court. Enrico Dandolo was nearly blind, well past his 80th year, yet his mind remained sharp as a Damascene blade. When the representatives of the crusading lords came to negotiate passage, Dandolo listened with the patience of a spider waiting. At the center of its web, the crusaders needed ships, provisions, and transportation for their holy war. Venice, the greatest maritime power of the age, could provide all of this, but at a price. The price, when it was finally named, was staggering. 85,000 marks of silver, a sum so vast that it would strain the treasuries of entire kingdoms. The crusading lords agreed, confident that the faithful would rally to their cause with both prayers and purses. But faith, as they would learn, does not always translate into silver coins. When the great crusading army gathered in Venice in the summer of 1202, they found themselves woefully short of the promised payment. They had men, they had weapons, they had holy zeal burning in their hearts, but they did not have nearly enough money to pay for their passage. Dandolo, that ancient master of statecraft, had perhaps anticipated this very situation. With the courtesy of a grandfather and the calculation of a merchant prince, he proposed a solution. The Crusaders could work off their debt by performing a small service for Venice first. They would help the Republic recapture the rebellious city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast. There was only one small problem with this arrangement. Zara was a Christian city, populated by fellow Catholics who had placed themselves under the protection of the King of Hungary, himself a crusader. The Pope had expressly forbidden any attack on Christian lands. But the crusaders were trapped, caught between their sacred vows and their crushing debt. In the calm of this evening hour, we can perhaps understand the terrible position in which these men found themselves. They had taken vows to reclaim the Holy Land, had kissed goodbye to wives and children, had mortgaged their estates and their futures for this sacred purpose. To turn back now would mean not only personal shame, but the abandonment of their most solemn promises to God. So they told themselves that this detour to Zara would be brief, that they would quickly settle Venice's account and then continue on to their holy mission. They told themselves that sometimes the path to righteousness requires difficult choices. They told themselves many things as their ships set sail across the Adriatic toward the doomed city. Zara fell quickly. Its walls, built to resist raiders and pirates, could not withstand the siege engines and disciplined assault of Western Europe's finest knights. The city was sacked, its treasures divided, and the Crusaders' debt to Venice was partially paid. But in breaking down those walls, they had also broken something more precious and fragile, the moral authority of their cause. Pope Innocent III was furious when news reached Rome. He excommunicated the entire crusading army, though he later lifted the ban from all except the Venetians. But words of forgiveness could not repair what had been damaged. The crusade had tasted the fruit of forbidden conquest and found it sweet. It was during the winter spent in the ruins of Zara that fate introduced a new player to this unfolding drama. His name was Alexios Angelos, and he was the son of a deposed Byzantine emperor. Young, desperate, and filled with promises that sparkled like winter frost in the morning sun, he came to the Crusaders with a proposition that would change the course of history. Alexios told a tale of usurpation and injustice. His father, Isaac II Angelos, had been the rightful emperor of Byzantium until his own brother, Alexios III, had seized the throne in a palace coup. The rightful emperor was now imprisoned, blinded according to Byzantine custom, while the usurper sat upon the throne of Constantinople. But here, said young Alexios, was an opportunity for the Crusaders to perform a truly righteous act. Help him reclaim his father's throne, and he would pay them handsomely for their trouble. More than that, he would reunite the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority, and he would join their crusade with the full resources of the Byzantine Empire. The promises were magnificent, glittering like the golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia itself. 200,000 marks of silver to pay their debts and finance their expedition. 10,000 Byzantine soldiers to join their ranks. A year's provisions for the entire army. And most precious of all, the end of the schism that had divided Christianity for centuries. Listen carefully to the wind outside your window, dear friend, and perhaps you can hear what the wiser voices tried to tell them even then. Perhaps you can hear the whispers of doubt, the warnings that promises made by exiles are often written in water, that the gratitude of princes is as fleeting as morning dew. And so, in the spring of 1203, the great fleet of the Fourth Crusade set sail not for Egypt or the Holy Land, but for Constantinople. As they approached the Queen of Cities, many of the Crusaders saw it for the first time, and their breath caught in their throats at the sight. Geoffrey de Villehardouin, who chronicled their journey, wrote of that moment with wonder that still echoes across the centuries. The city rose from the waters of the Bosphorus, like a vision from the book of Revelation, its walls gleaming white in the morning sun, its churches and palaces crowned with domes that caught and reflected the light. Like captured stars. Never, wrote Villehardouin, had so many people gazed upon such a city. Its wealth was beyond calculation, its beauty beyond description. Ships from every corner of the known world crowded its harbors. The scent of incense drifted from 1,000 churches. In the great palace, emperors had ruled for 800 years, their authority acknowledged from the Danube to the Nile. But for all its magnificence, Constantinople in 1203, was a city in decline. The empire that had once stretched from Italy to Armenia now controlled little more than the area around the capital itself. Court intrigue had weakened the throne, while foreign enemies pressed ever closer to the city's walls. The reigning emperor, Alexios III, was no warrior hero in the mold of Justinian or Heraclius. When the crusading fleet appeared in the Golden Horn, and young Alexios Angelos was proclaimed as the rightful emperor, Alexios III chose discretion over valor. Under cover of darkness, he fled the city with as much of the imperial treasury as he could carry, leaving behind a throne that his nephew was welcome to claim. Young Alexios IV, as he now styled himself, was restored to his father's throne amid great ceremony and apparent rejoicing. The blind Isaac II was brought from his prison to rule jointly with his son, and it seemed for a moment that the Crusaders' intervention had achieved a bloodless triumph. But promises, like shadows, grow longer as the day wanes. The silver that Alexios had pledged proved difficult to collect from a treasury already emptied by his predecessor. The troops he had promised were reluctant to march for a ruler imposed by foreign armies. Most troubling of all, the reunion of the churches that had seemed so simple in theory proved impossibly complex in practice. The people of Constantinople had not asked to be liberated, and they watched with growing resentment as their new emperor lavished honors and gifts upon them all. Western soldiers who had brought him to power. In the streets and squares of the city, voices began to murmur that these Latins were not saviors, but conquerors. Not liberators, but a new kind of invader. Month by month, the situation deteriorated. Alexios IV found himself caught between the impatient demands of his Western allies and the sullen hostility of his own people. He raised taxes to pay the Crusaders, which only increased popular discontent. He delayed the promised reunion of the churches, which frustrated his papal supporters. In the comfortable darkness of this quiet evening, we can perhaps imagine the sleepless nights that young emperor must have endured, pacing the marble floors of the great palace, watching the waters of the Bosphorus reflect the stars, and wondering how his glittering promises had turned to lead in his hands. In January of 1204, the inevitable happened. A popular uprising swept through Constantinople, led by a nobleman named Alexios Doukas, who took the throne as Alexios V. Young Alexios IV was murdered in his palace. His father Isaac died of shock or poison, and the new emperor immediately repudiated all agreements with the Crusaders. The message to the Western army was clear and uncompromising. Leave our city. Abandon your claims, sail away, and trouble us no more. The gates of Constantinople were barred against them, and the great chain that guarded the Golden Horn was drawn tight. For the Crusaders, camped now in the shadow of the city they had helped to restore, this betrayal cut deeper than any sword. They had shed blood for Byzantium, had restored its rightful emperor, had shown mercy when they might have claimed conquest. And now they were being told to depart empty-handed, their sacrifices scorned, their honor insulted. The die was cast. On that winter day, when Alexios V sealed the city against them, what followed was perhaps inevitable, yet no less tragic for its inevitability. If Constantinople would not honor its debts willingly, then those debts would be collected by force. On April 13, 1204, the walls of Constantinople were breached. For the first time in 800 years, the Great Sea Wall, which had protected the city from naval assault since the days of Constantine himself, crumbled before the concentrated assault of Western siege engines. What followed was 3 days of horror that scarred the soul of Eastern Christianity. The city that had preserved the treasures of classical antiquity, that had kept alive the learning of ages, that had stood as the bulwark of Christendom against wave after wave of invasion, was sacked by fellow Christians. Churches were stripped of their golden ornaments, their sacred icons trampled underfoot by soldiers seeking hidden wealth. The great library of Constantinople, which held manuscripts dating back to the time of the apostles, was scattered to the winds. Priceless works of art, irreplaceable treasures of human civilization, were melted down for their precious metals or carried off as booty. The 4 bronze horses that had watched over the hippodrome since the days of Constantine were torn from their pedestals and shipped to Venice, where they still stand today as monuments to that terrible triumph. The Palla d'Oro, that masterpiece of Byzantine goldwork, was broken apart and its jewels distributed among the conquerors. But perhaps most tragic of all was the psychological wound inflicted upon the Byzantine people. For 8 centuries, they had seen their city as the New Jerusalem, the earthly reflection of the city of God. They had believed themselves to be the chosen guardians of true Christianity, the heirs of both Rome and Israel, not to see their sacred city violated by those who claimed to serve the same Christ. To watch Latin priests celebrate Mass in their desecrated churches, to witness the partition of their empire among Western nobles, was a trauma from which the Byzantine soul never fully recovered. As we sit here in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and letting the tensions of the day dissolve into quietness, we must acknowledge that some wounds cut too deep for time alone to heal. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was such a wound. Though the Byzantines would eventually recapture their capital, though they would rebuild their churches and restore their ceremonies, though they would reign again from the great palace for another 2.5 centuries, something essential had been broken that April day and could never be fully repaired. The trust between Eastern and Western Christianity, already strained by theological disputes and cultural differences, was shattered beyond mending. When later emperors appealed to the West for help against the growing Ottoman threat, their pleas fell on ears deafened by the memory of 1204. When the final siege came in 1453, Constantinople would stand essentially alone, abandoned by the very people who should have been her natural allies. The Fourth Crusade achieved none of its stated objectives. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, the Holy Land was not reclaimed, and the unity of Christendom was more fractured than ever. Instead of strengthening the Christian world against its external enemies, it had turned Christian swords against Christian shields, brother against brother, believer against believer. Yet even in this darkest chapter of Byzantine history, we can find threads of light to carry with us into peaceful sleep. The fact that the empire survived it all, that it eventually recovered from this catastrophe, speaks to the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. The fact that Byzantine scholars preserved so much of classical learning, even through this time of chaos, reminds us that dedication to knowledge and beauty can survive even the worst disasters. And perhaps most importantly, the tragedy of 1204 teaches us the precious value of trust, the fragility of friendship between peoples, and the care we must take never to let political ambition or religious zeal overcome our basic humanity toward one another. As you drift toward peaceful dreams tonight, let the memory of Constantinople's suffering remind you to cherish the bonds of fellowship in your own life, to guard against the pride that turns allies into enemies, and to remember that the greatest victories are often won not through conquest, but through understanding. The golden domes of Hagia Sophia still caught the morning light even after that terrible April, and life continued in the Queen of Cities even after her darkest hour. Such is the miracle of human endurance. Such is the hope that carries us through even the longest nights toward the promise of dawn. The night has grown deeper still, and as we turn another page in our journey through time, we find ourselves witnessing one of history's most remarkable resurrections. Sometimes, dear listener, When all seems lost, when the darkness appears complete, the human spirit finds within itself reserves of strength that even it did not know existed. Let your breathing slow and steady as we watch the phoenix of Byzantium rise from the ashes of 1204, wounded but not broken, diminished but not destroyed. This is the story of the Palaiologos restoration, of an empire's twilight that burned with surprising brightness. Even as the shadows gathered around it, close your eyes and let us travel together to a world where hope flickered like candle flame. In the wind, where emperors ruled from exile, and where the dream of Rome refused to die, even when Rome itself seemed nothing more than a memory. Asterisk. In the aftermath of that terrible April day in 1204, when the walls of Constantinople fell and the city was given over to 3 days of pillage, it seemed as though the Byzantine Empire had breathed its last. The Latin nobles who had conquered the Queen of Cities divided her territories among themselves like merchants parceling out goods at a market. Aldwin of Flanders took the title of Latin Emperor and established his court in the great palace where Constantine had once ruled. Venice claimed the choicest commercial districts and strategic islands. Norman and French knights carved out duchies and kingdoms from the scattered provinces of what had once been the mightiest empire in Christendom. But empires, like the human soul, can be more resilient than their conquerors imagine. In the mountains of Anatolia, in the coastal cities of the Black Sea, in remote valleys where Byzantine nobles had fled with their retainers and their treasures, the idea of the empire lived on. 3 separate Byzantine successor states emerged from the wreckage, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to the throne of the Caesars. In Trebizond, on the distant shores of the Black Sea, the Grand Komnenoi established an empire that would survive until 1461. In Epirus, in what is now northwestern Greece, the despotate of Epirus controlled much of the Western Balkans. And in Nicaea, just across the narrow waters from occupied Constantinople, the most important of these successor states took root. Picture, if you will, the court of the Empire of Nicaea in those early years of exile. Here, in a city that had once hosted the great church council that defined Christian doctrine, Byzantine nobles and scholars gathered around emperors who ruled without their capital, who wore crowns while gazing across the water at the domes and towers that should have been theirs. Asterisk, the first emperor of Nicaea was Theodore, the first Lascaris, a man whose very name seemed to promise resurrection. Like Lazarus emerging from the tomb, he gathered around himself the scattered remnants of Byzantine power and began the slow, patient work of restoration. Theodore understood what many conquerors throughout history have failed to grasp, that military victory is only the beginning of true conquest. The Latin Empire that ruled from Constantinople had superior weapons, better trained knights, and the backing of Western Europe's most powerful kingdoms. But it lacked something far more precious and far more difficult to obtain: the loyalty of the people it claimed to rule. The Greek-speaking population of Anatolia and the Balkans had never asked to be liberated by Western crusaders. They viewed the Latin Empire not as a restoration of proper order, but as a foreign occupation. When Byzantine tax collectors were replaced by Frankish ones, when Orthodox priests were subordinated to Catholic bishops, when ancient Greek customs were swept aside in favor of Western practices, the people remembered the empire they had lost. Theodore and his successors built their strategy around this fundamental truth. They portrayed themselves not as rebels against legitimate authority, but as the guardians of an ancient tradition, the protectors of Orthodox Christianity, the rightful heirs to a throne that had been stolen rather than conquered. Year by year, village by village, they expanded their territory, not through dramatic campaigns that might attract the attention of their powerful enemies, but through patient diplomacy, careful alliances with local leaders, and the gradual erosion of Latin authority in the countryside. The second emperor of Nicaea, John III Doukas Vatatzes, proved to be one of the most skilled rulers in Byzantine history. He combined military prowess with economic wisdom, understanding that a restored empire would need not just soldiers, but prosperity. Under his rule, Nicaea became a center of learning and culture that rivaled the great cities of the West. Think of those scholars and artists who gathered at the Nicene court, working by candlelight to copy the manuscripts that preserved the wisdom of ages, creating new works of theology and philosophy, even while their homeland remained under foreign rule. They kept alive not just the political idea of Byzantium, but its intellectual and spiritual essence. By the middle of the 13th century, the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean had shifted dramatically. The Latin Empire, never truly stable, was weakening year by year. Its Western supporters were distracted by conflicts closer to home, while its local population grew increasingly restive under foreign rule. Meanwhile, the Empire of Nicaea had grown strong. Its armies were well-trained and highly motivated, fighting not just for conquest, but for the restoration of what they saw as the natural order of the world. Its treasury was full, fed by the prosperity that good governance had brought to Anatolia. Most importantly, its cause had captured the imagination of Orthodox Christians throughout the region. The man who would complete the work of restoration was Michael VIII Palaiologos, a name that would echo through the final centuries of Byzantine history. Tall, charismatic, and possessed of a political cunning that impressed even his enemies, Michael combined the virtues of a soldier with the skills of a diplomat. In 1261, almost 60 years after the fall of Constantinople to the Fourth Crusade, Michael's general Alexios Strategopoulos approached the great city with a small force. What happened next seemed almost miraculous to those who witnessed it. The Latin garrison, weakened by years of neglect and reduced to a mere shadow of its former strength, simply melted away. On July 25, 1261, Michael VIII Palaiologos entered Constantinople through the Golden Gate, following the same triumphal route that had been used by Roman emperors for centuries. The crowds that lined the streets wept with joy as they watched the purple banners of Byzantium replace the alien standards that had flown over their city for so long. Imagine that moment, dear listener, as you rest quietly in the darkness. Imagine the sound of church bells ringing across the 7 hills of Constantinople, announcing to the world that the empire had returned. Imagine the tears of old men and women who had never expected to see this day, who had lived their entire adult lives under foreign rule and had given up hope that the natural order would ever be restored. Asterisk. The restored Byzantine Empire of the Palaiologos dynasty was not the mighty realm that Justinian had ruled or that Basil II had expanded to its greatest extent. It controlled little more than Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, parts of Anatolia, and some territory in Greece. Yet within these reduced borders, something remarkable occurred. This was the era of the Palaiologos Renaissance, a flowering of art, literature, and scholarship that proved Byzantine civilization still possessed creative vitality, even in its reduced circumstances. The mosaics created during this period rival anything from the empire's golden age, their golden backgrounds seeming to glow with an inner light that speaks of spiritual as well as artistic achievement. In the scriptorium of the restored great palace, scholars worked to preserve and copy the classical texts that had survived the chaos of the 13th century. They knew, perhaps better than anyone, how fragile the thread was that connected their present to the glorious past. Each manuscript copied was a victory against the forces of forgetting, each preserved text a bridge across the gulf of time. Emperor John VIII Palaiologos, who ruled in the 15th century, was himself a scholar and patron of learning. He understood that while his empire might lack the military might to compete with the rising Ottoman power, it could still serve as a beacon of culture and wisdom for the Orthodox world. Under his patronage, The Platonic Academy of Constantinople was established, bringing together scholars from across the Greek-speaking world to study the works of Plato and Aristotle. These men would later carry their learning to the West, contributing to what we now call the Renaissance by reintroducing Western Europe to classical Greek philosophy and literature. Yet even as Byzantine culture flourished in this Indian summer of the empire's existence, the rulers of Constantinople faced challenges that would have broken the spirit of lesser people. The Ottoman Empire, rising like a crescent moon in the east, grew stronger with each passing decade. Ottoman armies controlled most of Anatolia, the traditional heartland of Byzantine power to the north. Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms that had once acknowledged Byzantine supremacy now pursued their own ambitions. To the west, the Italian city-states and the emerging kingdoms of Western Europe viewed Byzantium as an interesting relic of the past, rather than a serious political power. Most painful of all, the hoped-for reconciliation with Western Christianity remained as elusive as ever. The trauma of 1204 had created wounds too deep for diplomatic niceties to heal. When Byzantine emperors attempted to negotiate church union with Rome in exchange for military support against the Ottomans, they faced fierce resistance from their own clergy and people. The Emperor John VIII spent years traveling through Western Europe, attending councils, negotiating with popes and kings, always seeking the alliance that might save his shrinking empire. At the Council of Florence in 1439, he even agreed to a formal reunion of the Eastern and Western churches, accepting papal supremacy in exchange for promises of military aid, but promises from Western princes proved as insubstantial as morning mist. The promised crusade never materialized, while the religious concessions John had made earned him only the bitter resentment of his Orthodox subjects, who viewed any compromise with Rome as a betrayal of their faith. There is something profoundly moving about the Byzantine Empire during these final centuries, something that speaks to the deepest places in the human heart. Here was a civilization that knew it was dying, yet refused to surrender its dignity or abandon its highest aspirations. Emperors of this period lived with a constant awareness of their precarious position. They ruled over a city that was still magnificent, but increasingly empty, a capital whose population had dwindled from the hundreds of thousands who had lived there in the empire's prime to perhaps 50,000 souls who remained loyal to the purple banner, yet they continued to observe the ancient ceremonies, to maintain the elaborate court protocols that had been refined over centuries, to commission works of art and scholarship as if their empire would endure forever. There is something both heartbreaking and inspiring about this determination to maintain civilization's forms, even as its foundations crumbled. In the churches of Constantinople during these twilight years, the divine liturgy continued to be celebrated with the same solemnity and beauty that had marked it for centuries. The golden mosaics still caught and reflected the light of countless candles, creating an atmosphere of otherworldly beauty that transported worshippers beyond the troubles of their earthly existence. Byzantine scholars continued their work of preservation and commentary, knowing that each text they saved might be the only copy to survive the coming darkness. They wrote with a poignancy born of the knowledge that they were racing against time, that their civilization's accumulated wisdom hung by threads that grew more fragile with each passing year. The foreign policy of the later Byzantine Empire became an intricate dance of survival, a delicate balancing act performed on the edge of an abyss. Each emperor had to navigate between the growing Ottoman threat, the unreliable promises of Western aid, and the fierce independence of his Orthodox subjects, who would rather die free than live as religious subjects of Rome. Sometimes this meant allying with Muslim powers against Christian ones, if such alliances offered hope of survival. Sometimes it meant making concessions to the West that the emperor knew would be unpopular at home. Always it meant walking a tightrope where a single misstep could mean the end of everything. The Emperor Constantine, the 11th Palaiologus, who would be the last to bear that ancient title, understood perhaps better than anyone the impossible position his empire occupied. He spent his reign attempting to strengthen Constantinople's defenses, to rally what remained of Byzantine military power, and to secure even minimal assistance from the Christian powers of Europe. His letters to Western rulers during the 1440s and early 1450s make for heartbreaking reading. Here was the heir to Caesar and Augustus, the successor to Constantine and Justinian, reduced to pleading for a few ships, a handful of soldiers, some cannon and gunpowder to defend the city that had once been the center of the civilized world. As we sit here in the quietness of this late hour, preparing our hearts for the final chapter of this ancient story, we must marvel at the sheer tenacity of the Byzantine spirit. For 2.5 centuries after the traumatic events of 1204, the empire not only survived, but created works of lasting beauty and preserved treasures of human knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. The Palaiologos restoration proved that political defeat need not mean cultural death, that military weakness need not translate into spiritual poverty. Even as their territorial holdings shrank to little more than a city-state, the Byzantines maintained their sense of mission as guardians of Orthodox Christianity and preservers of classical learning. They remind us that true greatness is measured not only in the extent of one's dominions or the number of one's victories, but in the courage to maintain one's highest ideals, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The scholars who copied manuscripts in the shadow of Ottoman expansion, the artists who created mosaics while siege engines thundered in the distance, the emperors who maintained the dignity of their office, even when that office commanded little more than ceremonial respect, all bear witness to the nobility of the human spirit. As you prepare to drift into peaceful sleep, carry with you this image of Byzantium in its final centuries, not as a dying ember, but as a flame that burned all the brighter for knowing that its time was short. Like a sunset that paints the sky with its most brilliant colors just before darkness falls, the restored Byzantine Empire achieved a beauty and poignancy that its more powerful predecessors might have envied. The purple banners still flew from the walls of Constantinople. The golden eagles still gleamed in the morning sun. And in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the ancient prayers still rose like incense toward the heavens. Whatever darkness might come, these things endured, these beauties persisted, these traditions maintained their sacred watch over the sleeping city. Tomorrow, in our final chapter, we will witness the end of this long story. But tonight, let us rest in the knowledge that empires may fall, but the human capacity for courage, beauty, and hope endures as long as there are hearts to remember and voices to tell the tale. As we draw closer to the end of our journey through the Byzantine Empire, let us settle into this final chapter with heavy hearts, yet filled with admiration for the courage that would soon illuminate the darkest hour in Constantinople's history. The year is 1453, and the great city that has stood for over 1,000 years as the last beacon of Rome is about to face its ultimate test. Picture, if you will, the early morning mist rising from the Bosphorus, carrying with it the whispered prayers of a city that knows its time has come. The massive walls of Theodosius, those ancient guardians that have protected Constantinople through countless sieges, now stand weathered and weary, like old soldiers who have fought too many battles. Their stones, once pristine and proud, bear the scars of time and conflict, yet they stand resolute, ready for one final stand. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, a young man of 21 with the ambition of Alexander and the strategic mind of Caesar, has spent years preparing for this moment. They call him Mehmet the Conqueror, though that title has yet to be earned. In the camps outside Constantinople's walls, his massive army stretches as far as the eye can see. Over 100,000 men have gathered here, drawn from every corner of the Ottoman Empire. Their tents dot the landscape like a sea of canvas, and the smoke from their countless cooking fires creates a haze that obscures the horizon. But it is not just the size of Mehmet's army that strikes fear into the hearts of Constantinople's defenders. The young sultan has brought with him something the world has never seen before on such a scale: massive bronze cannons, the largest ever constructed. The great cannon of Orban, a Hungarian engineer who had offered his services first to the more Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI, only to be turned away due to lack of funds, now serves the Ottoman cause. This monster of bronze and iron stretches 27 feet in length and can hurl stone balls weighing over half a ton across vast distances. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos moves through the streets like a ghost among his people. At 48 years old, he bears the weight of an empire that exists now only within these ancient walls. His dark eyes, once bright with the hope of restoration, now carry the quiet dignity of a man who knows he will not live to see another sunrise beyond these walls, yet refuses to abandon his sacred duty. The emperor's palace, once the center of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, now feels empty and vast. The great halls that once echoed with the voices of ambassadors from distant lands now know only the footsteps of a handful of loyal servants and the whispered consultations of war councils. Yet Constantine carries himself with the same regal bearing as his ancestors, understanding that, in these final days, it is not the size of his empire that matters, but the dignity with which he faces its end. The city's population has dwindled to perhaps 50,000 souls, a fraction of its former glory. These are the faithful who chose to remain, to stand with their emperor and their God in the face of overwhelming odds. They move through the streets with the quiet determination of people who have made peace with their fate. Mothers hold their children closer, fathers teach their sons to pray, and the elderly share stories of the old days when Byzantium's eagles soared over lands from the Danube to the Euphrates, dot in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia. The divine liturgy continues as it has for nearly 1,000 years. The ancient prayers, sung in Greek, rise toward the great dome like incense, carrying with them the hopes and fears of a dying empire. The golden mosaics, though some bear the scars of iconoclastic periods, still gleam in the candlelight, depicting Christ Pantocrator, gazing down with eyes that seem to understand the trials of mortal men. The siege begins in earnest in early April, and the great cannons of Mehmet begin their terrible work. The sound is unlike anything the world has heard before, a roar that shakes the very foundations of the city, that rattles the windows of Hagia Sophia and causes the ancient stones of the hippodrome to tremble. When the massive stone balls strike the walls, they send cascades of rubble into the streets below, and dust clouds rise like the breath of some underground dragon. Day after day, the bombardment continues. The Ottoman engineers work through the night, cooling their great cannons with buckets of water and olive oil, preparing them for the next day's assault. The citizens of Constantinople grow accustomed to the rhythm of destruction, the distant thunder of the cannons, the whistle of the great stones through the air, the crash of impact, and then the blessed silence before the next shot. Yet even as their walls crumble around them, the defenders refuse to yield. Led by the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, they work through the night to repair each breach, hauling stones and timber, mixing mortar by torchlight. Women and children join the effort, carrying water to the workers, tending to the wounded, and offering what comfort they can in these dark hours. Constantine XI himself walks the walls each evening, speaking quietly with his soldiers, sharing their meager rations, and kneeling with them in prayer. He wears no crown in these final days, only the simple robes of a soldier, yet his presence seems to strengthen the resolve of every man who looks upon him. Here is an emperor who will not flee to safety, who will not abandon his people, who understands that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in survival, but in the courage to face the inevitable with dignity. As the weeks pass, the walls that have protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years begin to show fatal wounds. Great gaps appear in the ancient fortifications, and though the defenders fill them with whatever materials they can find, stones from ruined buildings, barrels filled with earth, even the marble statues of long-dead emperors, everyone knows that the end is drawing near. On the night of May 28, 1453, a strange silence falls over the city. The Ottoman cannons have ceased their bombardment, and in the eerie quiet, the people of Constantinople sense that the final act is about to begin. Emperor Constantine gathers his remaining nobles and commanders in the palace for what all know will be their last council. In a voice steady but heavy with sorrow, the emperor speaks to his loyal followers. He tells them that he has received offers from Sultan Mehmet. He may leave the city in safety, taking with him whatever treasures he can carry, if only he will surrender Constantinople without further bloodshed. The palace falls silent as Constantine's words hang in the air like smoke from a dying fire. But then the emperor continues, and his voice grows stronger. He tells them that he was born in the purple of this palace, crowned as a Roman emperor, in the tradition that stretches back over 2,000 years. He cannot abandon the city that has been the heart of Christian civilization in the East. He cannot betray the trust of those who have remained loyal to the very end. If Constantinople must fall, then let it fall with its emperor upon its walls, fighting to the last breath. His words move his listeners to tears, and they pledge their lives to stand with him in these final hours. Together, they walk through the empty corridors of the palace, past the faded frescoes of victorious emperors, past the silent throne room where the last echoes of Byzantine power still linger in the shadows. The emperor's final act before the battle is to visit Hagia Sophia one last time. As he enters the great cathedral, he finds it filled with his people, nobles and commoners, soldiers and civilians, Greeks and Latins, all united in this moment of prayer. The great dome seems to embrace them all, and in the flickering candlelight, the ancient mosaics appear to come alive, bearing witness to this final gathering of the faithful. Constantine kneels before the altar, and in the silence that follows, every person in the cathedral understands that they are witnessing the end of an era. The last Roman emperor prays not for victory, for that is beyond hope now, but for courage, for the strength to face whatever comes with the dignity befitting the heirs of Caesar. And Augustus. As dawn breaks on May 29, 1453, the final assault begins. The Ottoman army advances like a dark tide toward the broken walls of Constantinople. The Janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Sultan, lead the charge, their white felt caps distinctive among the sea of turbans and helmets. Behind them come the irregulars, thousands upon thousands of men who see in this assault the chance for glory and plunder. Emperor Constantine, now dressed in the simple armor of a common soldier, takes his place at the breach in the wall near the gate of St. Romanos. Around him stand his last companions, Giovanni Giustiniani, wounded but still fighting, the Spanish nobleman Don Francisco de Toledo, and a handful of Greek nobles who have chosen to die as their ancestors lived, with swords in their hands and courage in their hearts. The fighting is fierce and desperate. The defenders, though vastly outnumbered, fight with the fury of men who know they are fighting not just for their lives, but for the very soul of their civilization. Every stone thrown, every sword thrust, every arrow loosed carries with it the weight of 1,000 years of history. But human courage, however great, cannot overcome impossible odds forever. As the morning sun climbs higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked stones, the Ottoman forces begin to overwhelm the breaches in the wall. Giovanni Giustiniani, severely wounded, is carried from the field, and his absence creates a gap in the defense that cannot be filled. It is in this moment that Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos makes his final choice. Seeing that the day is lost, seeing his city about to fall into enemy hands, he removes the imperial regalia that marks him as emperor. He casts aside his purple cloak, tears the golden eagles from his breastplate, and steps forward into the melee as a simple soldier of Byzantium. What happens next is shrouded in the chaos of battle and the mist of legend. Some say he fell fighting. At the breach, his sword in his hand and his face turned toward the enemy. Others claim he was last seen near the Golden Gate, making one final stand with a handful of his guardsmen. His body, when found among the fallen, was identified only by the purple boots that marked his imperial rank, for his face was so covered in dust and blood that even his closest companions could not recognize him. And so, in the dust and chaos of that terrible morning, the last Roman emperor fell, and with him died an empire that had endured for over 1,000 years. The great walls of Constantinople, which had protected the city through countless sieges, were finally breached beyond repair. The streets that had echoed with the chants of Orthodox liturgy for centuries now rang with the victory cries of Ottoman soldiers. Sultan Mehmet II, now truly earning his title of conqueror, enters the city in the afternoon of that fateful day. He makes his way directly to Hagia Sophia, that great cathedral that had been the spiritual heart of Byzantium for 9 centuries. Standing beneath the great dome, surrounded by the golden mosaics that had witnessed the prayers of countless generations, he declares that the ancient church will be converted into a mosque, a symbol of Islam's triumph over Christianity in the East. Yet even in this moment of absolute victory, there is something melancholy in the air. The Ottoman chroniclers note that Mehmet himself seemed moved by the ruins of the palace, by the fallen stones of the ancient walls, by the profound silence that had replaced the vibrant life of what had once been the greatest city in the Christian world. As the sun sets on May 29, 1453, it sets not just on a single day, but on an entire age. The last light of Rome, which had continued to burn in the east long after it was extinguished in the west, is finally snuffed out. The double-headed eagle of Byzantium, which had soared over the world for a millennium, spreads its wings one final time and then folds them forever. But empires, like the light of distant stars, sometimes shine brightest just before they fade from view. And in the courage of Constantine XI, in the loyalty of those who chose to remain and fight, in the dignity with which they faced their final hour, the Byzantine Empire achieved a kind of immortality that no conquest could destroy. Great bells of Constantinople, which had rung for over 1,000 years to mark the hours of prayer and celebration, fell silent that day. But their echo, like the echo of all great and noble things, continues to resonate through the corridors of time, reminding us that some lights, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished. And so ends the story of the last day of Byzantium, when the sun set forever on the empire that refused to fall, until at last it could refuse no longer. As we reach the end of our long journey through the Byzantine Empire, let us pause for a moment in the gentle darkness of this concluding hour. The candles have burned low, the ancient stones have grown cold, and the last emperor has taken his place among the shadows of history. Yet something remarkable happens when we look more closely at the story's end. We discover that endings, like the light of stars, are often more complex than they first appear. Picture these scholarly pilgrims, arriving in Florence, Venice, and Paris, their precious books tucked carefully in their traveling packs. They brought with them not just knowledge, but a way of thinking that had been refined over centuries of Byzantine civilization. Their understanding of ancient Greek, their mastery of classical philosophy, their expertise in theology and law, would transform the intellectual landscape of Western Europe. The Renaissance, in many ways, was Byzantium's final gift to the world, Even within the Ottoman Empire itself, the legacy of Byzantium proved impossible to erase completely. The new rulers of Constantinople found themselves inheriting not just a city, but a complex administrative system that had governed the Eastern Mediterranean for over a millennium. Ottoman legal codes incorporated elements of Byzantine law. The architectural traditions of the city influenced the great mosques that would rise alongside the converted Hagia Sophia. The very layout of the imperial court, with its elaborate ceremonies and hierarchies, bore the unmistakable influence of Byzantine tradition. Sultan Mehmed II himself, the conqueror of Constantinople, came to be fascinated by the history of the empire he had destroyed. He commissioned scholars to write histories of Byzantium, collected Byzantine artifacts, and even learned Greek to better understand the civilization over which he now ruled. In a strange twist of fate, the Ottoman Empire became, in some ways, the keeper of Byzantine memory. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, converted to a mosque but structurally unchanged, continued to inspire awe in all who entered it. Travelers from across the world would stand beneath its great dome and marvel at the engineering genius of Anthemius and Isidorus, the architects who had created this wonder nearly 1,000 years before the conquest. The building itself became a bridge between civilizations, a place where Islamic prayers rose toward a dome that had been designed to glorify the Christian God. In the art galleries and museums of the world today, Byzantine treasures continue to captivate viewers with their otherworldly beauty. The golden mosaics, the intricately carved ivory panels, the illuminated manuscripts with their jewel-like colors, these works speak to something eternal in the human spirit. They remind us that beauty, once created, transcends the empires that gave it birth. The influence of Byzantine art can be traced through the centuries, appearing in unexpected places. The golden backgrounds of medieval Western paintings owe their inspiration to Byzantine mosaics. The iconographic traditions of Eastern Europe preserved and developed the artistic vocabulary first perfected in the workshops of Constantinople. Even modern artists, seeking to capture something of the mystical and transcendent, often find themselves drawn to the visual language first spoken in the art of Byzantium. Perhaps most remarkably, the political ideals of Byzantium, the concept of a Christian empire, the notion of the emperor as God's vice-regent on earth, the dream of universal rule guided by divine law, continued to influence political thought long after the last emperor fell at the walls of Constantinople. The Holy Roman Empire in the west, the Russian Empire in the east, even the later Austrian and German empires, all carried within them echoes of the Byzantine political vision. The scholarly traditions of Byzantium also found new life in unexpected places. The University of Constantinople, though closed by the conquest, had trained generations of scholars whose influence spread across the Orthodox world. The theological debates that had occupied Byzantine intellectuals for centuries continued. In the academies of Kiev, Moscow, and Belgrade, the mathematical and scientific knowledge preserved in Byzantine libraries contributed to the gradual awakening of European science. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Byzantium lies not in its political influence or scholarly contributions, but in something more subtle and pervasive, a way of seeing the world that valued continuity over innovation, tradition over novelty, the eternal over the temporal. In an age when everything seemed to change with bewildering speed, Byzantium had represented stability, the reassuring presence of ancient wisdom in a chaotic world. This Byzantine sensibility, patient, contemplative, deeply aware of the weight of history, can still be felt today in the Orthodox Christian world. In the monasteries of Mount Athos, where monks still live much as their predecessors did 1,000 years ago, the rhythm of prayer and contemplation continues unchanged. In the village churches of Greece and Russia, where candlelight still flickers before ancient icons. The spiritual world of Byzantium lives on, even the calendar by which much of Eastern Europe measures its religious year remains the old Julian calendar used by the Byzantine Empire, making their Christmas fall 13 days after the Western celebration. Time itself, in the Orthodox world, still moves to the rhythm established by the emperors of Constantinople. As we draw these reflections to a close, and as the night deepens around us, we might pause to consider what the story of Byzantium teaches us about the nature of endings and beginnings. Empires rise and fall, cities are conquered and rebuilt, but the human spirit, with its capacity for beauty, truth, and transcendence, proves remarkably resilient. The last emperor of Byzantium may have fallen on the walls of Constantinople, but the civilization he represented did not die with him. It transformed, adapted, found new expressions in new places. The light of Rome, which had burned in the East for over 1,000 years, was not extinguished, but rather scattered into countless smaller flames, each carrying something of the original. Fire. In the quiet hours of this night, as we prepare for sleep, we might imagine those flames still burning, in monastery cells where ancient prayers are whispered, in libraries where Byzantine manuscripts are carefully preserved, in the hearts of all who are moved by beauty and inspired by the example of those who chose dignity over survival, principle over pragmatism. The Byzantine Empire is gone, but Byzantium, the idea, the vision, a dream of a civilization guided by faith and learning, beauty and wisdom, that continues to live, as imperishable as the golden mosaics that still gleam in the dome of Hagia Sophia, as enduring as the human longing for something greater than ourselves. And so, as we conclude our journey through the empire that refused to fall, we carry with us not sadness for what was lost, but gratitude for what was preserved, and wonder at the mysterious ways in which the best of human achievement manages to survive even the darkest of endings. The last light of Rome has not truly been extinguished. It has simply taken new forms, found new homes, and continues to illuminate the path for all who seek beauty, truth, and meaning in this world. Sleep now, and dream of golden domes reflecting the morning sun, of voices raised in ancient songs, of the eternal city that lives on wherever human hearts still yearn for something magnificent and true.